The morning mist rose from the muddy waters of the Mississippi River as Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood atop the bluffs overlooking the mighty waterway. It was March 18, 1863, and the fate of the American Civil War hung in the balance like morning fog over the churning brown current below. Before him lay Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city that Confederate President Jefferson Davis had proclaimed the nail that holds the South to halves together. Grant's weathered hands gripped the brass telescope as he studied the imposing Confederate fortifications that crowned the 200-foot bluffs. The city's strategic position commanded a horseshoe bend in the Mississippi, making it virtually impregnable from direct river assault. For months, Union forces had hammered against this bastion without success. Their gunboats and armies repelled time and again by the natural fortress that seemed to mock their efforts. The Union's grand strategy was audacious in its simplicity: control the Mississippi River from its source to the Gulf of Mexico, thereby splitting the Confederacy in two and strangling the rebellion's lifeline. President Abraham Lincoln himself had declared that the war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. Vicksburg was that key, and Grant knew that its capture would accomplish what no amount of battlefield victories in Virginia could achieve: the complete isolation of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the Confederate states. As referenced in contemporary military correspondence from the National Archives, Grant had already proven his mettle at Fort Donelson and Shiloh, earning Lincoln's trust despite criticism from political opponents who questioned his unconventional methods. Now, faced with the most challenging campaign of his career, the general contemplated a daring plan that would require coordinating multiple armies across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, the Pennsylvania-born Confederate commander defending Vicksburg, had transformed the city into a fortress that seemed impregnable. His 30,000 troops occupied a network of trenches, redoubts, and artillery positions that stretched for miles around the city's perimeter. The Confederate fortifications included the formidable railroad redoubt, the Great Redoubt, and the Stock at Reading, each bristling with cannon that could devastate any approaching force. The civilian population of Vicksburg, numbering nearly 5,000 souls, had initially welcomed the war with patriotic fervor. Ladies had sewn battle flags, and men had rushed to enlist in companies with romantic names like the Vicksburg Southrons and the Warren County Light Infantry. But as the Union noose tightened around their city, reality began to replace romance. Food supplies dwindled, and the constant threat of bombardment cast a shadow over daily life. Grant's predecessor, Major General John Alexander McClernand, had failed spectacularly in his attempts to take the city through direct assault. The disastrous Chickasaw campaign had cost the Union nearly 2,000 casualties while achieving nothing. Now Grant faced the same geographical challenges that had stymied every previous Union commander: the Mississippi's treacherous currents, the impassable bayous and swamplands that surrounded Vicksburg, and the seemingly impregnable Confederate fortifications that commanded every approach. The general's blue eyes reflected the determination of a man who understood that failure here meant prolonging a war that had already cost hundreds of thousands of lives. As he lowered his telescope and turned toward his headquarters tent, Grant carried with him the weight of a nation's expectations and the knowledge that his next decisions would determine whether the United States would survive as one nation or fragment into two separate republics, forever divided by the great river that had once united them. The Louisiana sun beat mercilessly upon the backs of thousands of Union soldiers as they wielded picks and shovels. In what would become known as Grant's Folly, it was early April 1863, and the ambitious plan to bypass Vicksburg's guns by digging a canal across the narrow neck of land opposite the city had consumed weeks of backbreaking labor. The project, originally conceived by Union engineers and endorsed by President Lincoln himself, represented the first of several audacious attempts to circumvent the Confederate stronghold. Without launching a costly frontal assault, Colonel James Harrison Wilson, Grant's chief engineer, stood knee-deep in Mississippi mud as he supervised the massive excavation. The canal project required moving thousands of tons of earth to create a waterway that would theoretically allow Union gunboats and transports to bypass Vicksburg's deadly artillery batteries. 12,000 soldiers labored in shifts around the clock, their blue uniforms stained brown with Louisiana clay, their faces etched with the fatigue of men who had been promised quick victory, but found only endless toil. The strategic brilliance of the canal seemed obvious on paper. If successful, It would render Vicksburg's river defenses obsolete while providing Union forces with an alternative supply route down the Mississippi. Admiral David Dixon Porter's gunboat flotilla waited impatiently above Vicksburg, ready to steam through the proposed channel and establish Union control of the river below the city. The stakes could not have been higher. Control of the Mississippi meant control of Confederate supply lines from Texas and Arkansas, effectively cutting the rebellion's western territories off from Virginia and the Eastern Confederacy. As documented in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the canal project faced obstacles that grew more daunting with each passing day. The Mississippi's spring floods had raised the water level, but instead of helping to flush out the canal, the rushing current threatened to wash away months of work. Confederate artillery on the Vicksburg bluffs regularly shelled the work parties, forcing soldiers to dive for cover behind hastily constructed earthworks. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical hardship. Men began to question whether their commanders truly understood the magnitude of the task they had undertaken. Major General John Aaron Rawlins, Grant's chief of staff and closest confidant, watched the canal project with growing skepticism. A former lawyer from Galena, Illinois, Rawlins possessed the practical wisdom of a small-town attorney who could see through military pretensions to hard realities. He had observed Grant's increasing frustration as reports arrived daily of minimal progress and mounting difficulties. The general, who had earned fame for his decisive victories at Fort Henry, at Fort Donelson, now found himself mired in an engineering project that seemed to mock his reputation for swift, aggressive action. Confederate scouts reported the Union activities to General Pemberton with a mixture of amusement and concern, while some Confederate officers dismissed the canal as Yankee foolishness. Pemberton recognized the serious threat it posed to his defensive strategy. He ordered Captain Samuel Howard Lockett, his chief engineer, to position artillery to command any potential channel and to prepare countermeasures that would neutralize the Union advantage even if the canal succeeded. The human cost of the project mounted daily as soldiers succumbed to disease, exhaustion, and Confederate sharpshooters. Typhoid fever and dysentery swept through the camps, claiming more Union lives than enemy bullets. The Army's medical facilities, already strained by months of campaigning, struggled to cope with the influx of patients suffering from ailments that had nothing to do with conventional warfare, but everything to do with the brutal realities of military engineering in hostile territory. By late April, nature itself seemed to conspire against the Union effort. The Mississippi's unpredictable currents began depositing sediment faster than soldiers could excavate it, gradually filling the channel. Even as work continued, Grant, observing the futile struggle from his headquarters aboard the steamboat Magnolia, finally acknowledged what his engineers had suspected for weeks. The canal would never function as intended. The project that had consumed precious weeks and countless resources would be abandoned, forcing the Union commander to confront the uncomfortable truth that Vicksburg could not be conquered through engineering alone, but would require the kind of bold military action that had made his reputation. The darkness of April 16, 1863, provided the only cover Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet would have as they prepared for one of the most audacious naval operations of the Civil War. 11 gunboats and 3 transports loaded with supplies prepared to run the deadly gauntlet of Confederate artillery that lined the Vicksburg bluffs. The plan was born of desperation and daring in equal measure, with the canal project abandoned and traditional approaches proving futile. Grant needed his naval support below Vicksburg to implement his most ambitious strategy yet. Porter, a career naval officer whose father had served with distinction in the War of 1812, understood the magnitude of the risk he was about to undertake. The Confederate batteries commanding the river bend included some of the heaviest artillery in the South, 10-inch Columbiads, 8-inch naval rifles, and massive siege guns that could punch through the thickest armor his gunboats carried. His flagship, the ironclad Benton, would lead the procession, followed by the Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, and Carondelet, each vessel a floating fortress bristling with guns, but vulnerable to the plunging fire from the bluffs above. General Grant had positioned himself on the Louisiana shore opposite Vicksburg to observe the operation firsthand. The success of the naval passage would determine whether his grand strategy could proceed. Without Porter's gunboats below Vicksburg, Grant's army would remain trapped above the city, unable to cross the river and approach from the more vulnerable southern approaches. The general's normally stoic demeanor betrayed the tension he felt. as he watched the dark shapes of the fleet begin their dangerous journey. As chronicled in Admiral Porter's official dispatch, to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, the Confederate gunners had prepared meticulously for this moment. Captain Samuel D. Camp, commanding the river batteries, had positioned his artillery to create overlapping fields of fire that would subject any passing vessel to a devastating crossfire. The guns were loaded with solid shot designed to penetrate armor, explosive shells to damage superstructures, and heated shot intended to start fires aboard wooden vessels. The first gunboat, Benton, rounded the bend at 10:45 in the evening, its paddle wheels churning silently through the dark water. For several tension-filled minutes, it appeared the fleet might pass undetected. Then a Confederate sentry spotted the dark bulk of the ironclad against the starlit river, and suddenly the night exploded into hellish brilliance as every Confederate gun opened fire simultaneously. The sound was indescribable, a continuous thunderclap that shattered windows in Vicksburg and could be heard 20 miles away. Massive shells screamed through the darkness, their red-hot trajectories creating deadly arcs of light that illuminated the river, like the fireworks of some macabre celebration. The Union gunboats responded with their own artillery, their guns flashing like lightning as they returned fire at targets they could barely see on the bluffs above. Porter's flagship took hit after hit as it steamed through the gauntlet. Confederate solid shot punched through the Benton's iron plating, sending deadly splinters flying through the vessel's interior. One shell penetrated the pilot house, killing the helmsman instantly and wounding the other crew members. Yet the ironclad maintained course, its engine straining against the current while Confederate artillery continued to rain destruction from above. The transport Henry Clay, loaded with medical supplies and ammunition, proved less fortunate. A Confederate shell penetrated her boiler, and the resulting explosion illuminated the entire river as the vessel's cargo of munitions detonated in a spectacular fireball. The crew barely had time to abandon ship before the transport disappeared beneath the muddy waters of the Mississippi, taking with her desperately needed supplies for Grant's army. One by one, the remaining vessels fought their way through the bombardment. The gunboat Tuscumbia suffered severe damage to her smokestacks and superstructure, but remained afloat. The Louisville lost her steering gear and drifted helplessly for several terrifying minutes before her crew regained control. By dawn, 10 of the 14 vessels had successfully run the gauntlet, though all bore scars from their passage through what one Union sailor would later describe as the mouth of hell itself. The successful passage of Porter's fleet fundamentally altered the strategic situation at Vicksburg. Grant now possessed the naval support necessary to transport his army across the Mississippi and approach the Confederate fortress from its more vulnerable southern approaches. The morning of April 30th, 1863, marked the beginning of one of the most brilliant military campaigns in American history. General Grant stood on the deck of a transport steamer as the first elements of his army began crossing the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg, Mississippi, 30 miles below Vicksburg. The successful naval passage had provided him with the means to implement his most audacious plan, yet abandoning his supply lines entirely and striking inland to approach Vicksburg from the east, where Confederate defenses were weakest. The amphibious operation represented a logistical masterpiece orchestrated by Grant's staff under the supervision of Brigadier General James Birdseye McPherson and Major General John Alexander McClernand. 17,000 Union soldiers crossed the river in the first wave, their blue uniforms creating a human tide that flowed from the transports onto Mississippi soil. The men carried 3 days' rations and 40 rounds of ammunition per soldier, everything they would need until they could live off the countryside or capture Confederate supply depots. Major General John Stevens Bowen, commanding Confederate forces in the region, watched the Union crossing with growing alarm from his headquarters at Grand Gulf. His 4,000 troops were spread thin across miles of riverfront, inadequate to contest a determined Union landing. Bowen's urgent dispatches to General Pemberton in Vicksburg carried an increasingly desperate tone as he reported the magnitude of the Union operation unfolding before his eyes. The strategic brilliance of Grant's plan became apparent as Union forces rapidly expanded their beachhead rather than attacking Vicksburg directly. Grant intended to march northeast toward Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, severing Pemberton's supply lines and forcing the Confederate commander to abandon his fortifications to defend the interior. The plan required unprecedented coordination between multiple Union forces. General Nathaniel Prentice Banks was supposed to advance up the river, from New Orleans, while General Frederick Steele moved south from Arkansas, creating a three-pronged offensive that would crush Confederate resistance throughout the region, as documented in Grant's personal memoirs, published decades after the war. The general understood that his decision to abandon traditional supply lines represented the greatest gamble of his military career. Union armies typically required vast logistical networks to maintain themselves in the field, wagon trains carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment necessary to sustain tens of thousands of soldiers. By cutting loose from these conventional constraints, Grant was betting that his army could move faster than Confederate forces could react, capturing enemy supplies and living off the fertile Mississippi countryside. The first major engagement came at Port Gibson on May 1st, where Bowen's Confederate forces attempted to halt the Union advance. The battle raged from dawn until late afternoon across the rolling hills and dense woods of rural Mississippi. Union forces under General McClernand and General McPherson attacked with the confidence of men who knew they were executing a master plan, while Bowen's outnumbered Confederates fought with the desperation of soldiers who understood that retreat meant abandoning southern Mississippi to enemy occupation. The Confederate position at Port Gibson demonstrated the defensive advantages that had made Vicksburg so formidable. Bowen's artillery commanded the roads leading inland from the river, while his infantry occupied prepared positions that maximized the defensive potential of the terrain. Confederate sharpshooters, many of them local hunters familiar with every creek and gully, inflicted heavy casualties on advancing Union columns forced to attack across open ground. Yet numbers and determination eventually prevailed. McPherson's 17th Corps flanked the Confederate left, while McClernand's 13th Corps pressed the center. By late afternoon, Bowen's forces were in full retreat, abandoning their positions and falling back toward Vicksburg. The Union victory at Port Gibson opened the road to the interior and confirmed Grant's assessment that Confederate forces were too scattered to mount effective resistance to his inland campaign. The psychological impact of the Union landing reverberated throughout the Confederacy. For 2 years, Southern newspapers had proclaimed Vicksburg impregnable, the Gibraltar of the West that would forever protect Confederate control of the Mississippi River. Now Union forces were operating freely in the heart of Mississippi, threatening not only Vicksburg but Jackson, the state capital. Confederate authorities faced the terrifying prospect that Grant's army might accomplish through maneuver what months of direct assault had failed to achieve: the complete isolation and capture of the South's most important river fortress. The red dust of Mississippi roads clouded the morning air of May 7, 1863, as the armies raced toward the same objective with the desperate urgency of men who understood that hours might determine the fate of nations. General Grant's Union forces pressed northeastward toward Jackson, Mississippi, while Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston's reinforcements hurried southward from Tennessee, both commanders knowing that control of the state capital would determine whether Vicksburg could continue to resist Union siege. Johnston, recently recovered from wounds received at the Battle of Seven Pines, had been dispatched by Confederate President Jefferson Davis with explicit orders to coordinate the defense of Mississippi and relieve Pemberton's garrison at Vicksburg. The general's reputation as one of the South's most capable defensive strategists preceded him, and his arrival in Mississippi had initially raised Confederate hopes that Grant's audacious campaign might finally be stopped. However, Johnston's 12,000 reinforcements represented far fewer troops than he had requested, and his communications with Pemberton revealed dangerous confusion about Confederate strategy and priorities. The Union advance toward Jackson represented military movement at its most efficient. Grant's 3 corps, McClernand's 13th, McPherson's 17th, and Sherman's 15th moved along parallel roads that converged on the Mississippi capital. Like the fingers of a closing fist, each corps maintained contact with its neighbors while advancing at the maximum pace sustainable by foot soldiers carrying full equipment. In the Mississippi heat, the Army's abandoned supply lines were replaced by systematic foraging that stripped the countryside of provisions while maintaining strict discipline. To prevent the campaign from degenerating into lawless plunder, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding the 15th Corps, embodied the Union Army's new philosophy of total war. His red hair and intense blue eyes reflected an intellectual approach to warfare that recognized the conflict's true nature, not a gentleman's disagreement between honorable opponents, but a struggle for national survival that required the complete destruction of the enemy's capacity to resist. Sherman's soldiers moved with the efficiency of men who understood their mission extended beyond traditional battlefield victory to the systematic dismantling of Confederate infrastructure, as recorded in contemporary Confederate correspondence. Discovered in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, General Pemberton faced an impossible strategic dilemma. Johnston's orders directed him to unite their forces and attack Grant's army before it could capture Jackson. However, abandoning Vicksburg's fortifications would surrender the city that Davis himself had declared essential to Confederate survival. Pemberton's Pennsylvania birth made his loyalty suspect to some Confederate officers, adding personal pressure to an already overwhelming professional burden. The race intensified as both armies approached Jackson along roads that had witnessed the passage of American forces since territorial days. The Illinois Central Railroad, whose tracks connected Jackson to Vicksburg, became a strategic prize as valuable as any battlefield victory. Union forces understood that severing this connection would isolate Pemberton's garrison while providing Grant's army with a secure supply line once the railroad could be repaired and protected. Confederate resistance at Jackson proved sporadic and ineffective. Johnston's forces, exhausted by their forced march from Tennessee and demoralized by reports of Union victories throughout Mississippi, offered only token opposition before evacuating the capital on May 14th. The city's fall represented far more than the capture of government buildings and railroad junctions. It symbolized the Confederacy's inability to protect its heartland from Union penetration. The systematic destruction that followed Jackson's capture demonstrated Union commitment to total war. Sherman's engineers destroyed railroad bridges, telegraph lines, and military facilities with methodical precision. The city's foundries, which had produced artillery and ammunition for Confederate forces, were reduced to smoking ruins. Government buildings were occupied, their records seized or destroyed, and their functions transferred to Union military authorities. General Grant established his headquarters in the governor's mansion, a symbolic act that proclaimed Union authority over Mississippi's civil government. From this seat of Confederate state power, he issued orders that would determine Vicksburg's fate while coordinating with Union forces throughout the theater. The capture of Jackson had accomplished its strategic purpose, severing Pemberton's supply lines while positioning Union forces to attack Vicksburg from the east, where Confederate fortifications were weakest. The psychological impact of Jackson's fall extended far beyond Mississippi. Southern newspapers, which had spent 2 years proclaiming Confederate invincibility, struggled to explain how Union forces had penetrated so deeply into Confederate territory. Northern morale, conversely, soared as reports of Grant's victories reached Washington and convinced doubters that the war's tide was finally turning in the Union's favor. The morning mist of May 16, 1863, hung like a funeral shroud over Champion Hill, Mississippi, as the armies prepared for what would become the decisive battle of the Vicksburg campaign. General Pemberton's Confederate forces, numbering 22,000 men, had finally emerged from Vicksburg's fortifications to confront Grant's inland advance. But the delay had cost precious time and allowed Union forces to position themselves between the Confederate army and its fortress city. Pemberton's decision to fight at Champion Hill reflected the impossible choices facing Confederate commanders throughout the South. Johnston's orders demanded an offensive concentration against Grant's scattered forces, while Davis's directives insisted that Vicksburg must be held at all costs. The Pennsylvania-born general chose a middle course that satisfied neither requirement, advancing far enough from Vicksburg to threaten Grant's communications, while remaining close enough to retreat into the city's fortifications if the battle went badly. The tactical situation favored neither army decisively. Champion Hill's elevated position provided defensive advantages to whichever force controlled it first, while the network of roads converging on the battlefield offered multiple avenues of approach and retreat. Confederate forces under Brigadier General Stephen Dill Lee occupied the hill's crest at dawn, their artillery commanding the approaches, while infantry prepared defensive positions among the trees and ravines that scarred the hillside. Grant's response demonstrated the aggressive instincts that had made his reputation. Rather than attempting to flank the Confederate position or wait for reinforcements, he ordered immediate attacks by McPherson's 17th Corps and McClernand's 13th Corps. The Union assault began at 10:30 in the morning with the disciplined advance of veteran regiments whose battle flags bore the names of Shiloh, Fort Donelson, and a dozen other engagements that had forged them into one of the war's most effective fighting forces. As chronicled in the regimental histories preserved at the National Archives. The Battle of Champion Hill raged with an intensity that surprised even veteran soldiers accustomed to the war's increasing brutality. Confederate artillery, positioned to sweep the approaches to the hill, decimated Union ranks with canister and solid shot. The 33rd Illinois Infantry lost half its strength in the first assault, while the 23rd Indiana suffered similar casualties, attempting to capture a Confederate battery that dominated the battlefield center. The turning point came when Union forces discovered a gap in the Confederate line, where Brigadier General William Edwin Baldwin's brigade had failed to maintain contact with adjacent units. McPherson's corps poured through this weakness, threatening to cut the Confederate Army in two and capture the roads leading back to Vicksburg. Pemberton's forces, caught between the hammer of Union assault and the anvil of potential encirclement, began to withdraw in increasingly desperate disorder. Major General John Smith Bowen's Confederate division made a heroic attempt to stabilize the crumbling line, launching a counterattack that temporarily drove Union forces back down Champion Hill's slopes. Bowen's men, many of them Missouri troops who had followed him from the Trans-Mississippi, fought with the ferocity of soldiers who understood that defeat here meant the loss of Vicksburg, and quite possibly the war itself. Their charge broke through Union positions and captured several artillery pieces. Before Union reserves restored the line, the Confederate retreat from Champion Hill became a rout as Union cavalry and artillery pursued the broken remnants of Pemberton's army toward Vicksburg. The Big Black River, normally a minor obstacle, became a death trap as Confederate forces crowded onto the single bridge spanning the stream. Union artillery, positioned on the bluffs overlooking the river, turned the crossing into a killing ground where hundreds of Confederate soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Pemberton's losses at Champion Hill and the Big Black River effectively ended Confederate hopes of relieving Vicksburg through offensive action. Nearly 4,000 casualties and the capture of crucial artillery pieces had crippled the Army's offensive capability, while the demoralization of defeat had shattered Union cohesion that had taken years to develop. The survivors who reached Vicksburg's fortifications were exhausted, dispirited, and convinced that their cause was hopeless. The strategic consequences of Champion Hill extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Grant's army now controlled all approaches to Vicksburg except the river crossing to Louisiana, effectively isolating Pemberton's garrison from reinforcement or resupply. The Confederate fortress that had seemed impregnable from the river was now surrounded by Union forces equipped with the artillery and determination necessary to conduct a formal siege. General Grant's headquarters that evening buzzed with the controlled excitement of staff officers who recognized they were witnessing history. The campaign that had begun with the failed canal project had culminated in the isolation of the Confederacy's most important river fortress. As Grant studied maps showing Union positions encircling Vicksburg, he understood that the city's fall was now simply a matter of time and determination. The scorching heat of July 3, 1863, pressed down upon Vicksburg like the weight of impending doom as Confederate General Pemberton climbed the stairs to his headquarters for what both armies knew would be the final council of war. 47 days of siege had transformed the Queen City of the Bluffs into a landscape of destruction where civilians huddled in caves carved from the hillsides, while Confederate soldiers grimly manned fortifications that grew weaker with each passing day. The formal siege had begun on May 25th when Grant's initial assault against Vicksburg's eastern defenses had been repulsed with heavy Union casualties. The failure of direct attack had convinced the Union commander that patience and engineering would accomplish what valor alone could not. Throughout June, Union forces had systematically extended their trenches closer to Confederate lines, employing techniques perfected during the siege of Petersburg and adapted to Mississippi's unique terrain and climate. Major General John Aaron Rawlins, Grant's chief of staff, maintained the detailed records that documented the siege's progress day by day. Union engineers had dug miles of approach trenches, saps, and parallels that brought their artillery within point-blank range of Confederate fortifications. Massive naval guns, transported from Admiral Porter's fleet and positioned in specially constructed batteries, hurled shells weighing more than 200 pounds into the city around the clock, making normal life impossible for soldiers and civilians alike. The human cost of the siege extended far beyond military casualties to encompass the systematic destruction of civilian life in Vicksburg. Families that had welcomed the war with patriotic enthusiasm now lived like troglodytes in caves, hastily excavated in the city's hillsides. Food supplies, already strained by months of military occupation, dwindled to nothing as the Union blockade prevented all commerce along the Mississippi River. Residents began eating mules, dogs, and finally rats as starvation replaced Confederate artillery as the city's primary enemy. As documented in contemporary diary entries preserved at the Old Courthouse Museum in Vicksburg, civilian morale collapsed as the siege entered its sixth week. Marion Loughborough, whose cave diary would become one of the war's most poignant documents, described the psychological torture of constant bombardment. The screaming mortar shells were particularly dreadful. They came down with such fearful force, jarring the earth and making such a noise, while pieces of the shell would fly in all directions. Confederate soldiers faced conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Daily rations had been reduced to a handful of cornmeal and a few ounces of bacon when available. Scurvy and dysentery ravaged units that had once been the pride of the Confederate Army. Desertions increased as soldiers watched their families suffer, while Union forces grew stronger with each passing day. Yet discipline held, maintained by officers who understood that surrender meant the effective end of Confederate resistance west of the Mississippi River. Union forces, conversely, grew stronger as their siege lines extended and improved. Reinforcements arrived regularly, bringing the investing Army's strength to over 70,000 men supported by artillery. That included some of the war's most powerful siege guns. Grant's engineers had constructed a network of supply lines that connected the Army to bases along the Mississippi River, ensuring adequate provisions and ammunition for a siege of indefinite duration. The technological sophistication of the siege demonstrated how dramatically warfare had evolved since the conflict's beginning. Union forces employed techniques borrowed from European siege warfare, including the construction of covered approaches, the systematic destruction of enemy fortifications through concentrated artillery fire, and the use of mining operations designed to collapse Confederate defensive positions. The siege of Vicksburg represented industrial-age warfare applied to a traditional military problem. With devastating effectiveness, General Pemberton's final council of war convened as Confederate scouts reported that Union forces were preparing another general assault scheduled for July 6. The garrison's ammunition was nearly exhausted. Food supplies would last perhaps 3 more days, and civilian suffering had reached levels that military honor could no longer justify. Pemberton faced the most agonizing decision of his career: surrender the city that Davis had declared essential to Confederate survival, or condemn thousands of soldiers and civilians to death or capture in a hopeless final battle. The white flag that appeared over Vicksburg's courthouse on July 4, 1863, symbolized more than the surrender of a single city. Confederate control of the Mississippi River ended forever, splitting the rebellion and isolating Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the Eastern Confederacy. President Lincoln's prediction that the war could never be won until that key is in our pocket had proven prophetic. Vicksburg's fall, combined with the Union victory at Gettysburg, marked the beginning of the end for Confederate independence. As Grant and Pemberton met beneath the oak tree to negotiate surrender terms, both generals understood they were witnessing a turning point in American history. The Union's two-pronged strategy for dividing and conquering the South has succeeded beyond the most optimistic predictions, demonstrating that industrial might, superior logistics, and strategic patience could overcome even the most determined resistance when applied with skill and persistence.